2050 Carbon Neutral. Carbon Neutral Policy Overview. Hello everyone. I am NotTuber, who will gather everything of carbon neutrality and dig it up. So let's get started with today's contents. As carbon neutrality is an important global goal, the global economy and industry are changing as more countries participate in it. In short, a new international order based on decarbonization is being established. Major countries are moving rapidly to lead this new economic and industrial paradigm. Then, which direction should Korea move forward in this situation? The answer can be found by examining the current status of carbon neutrality promoted by the international community and the direction suggested by the global economy and industry. Let's go find the answer together. Go, go! 1. Current status of carbon neutrality promotion in the international community and Korea. Let's find out what kind of efforts the international community has made since the IPCC Special Report on achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. As a measure to respond to the climate crisis after the IPCC Special Report, the Climate Action Summit was held in New York in September 2019, and the 25th COP on climate change was held in December of the same year. With the Paris Agreement in effect, all news related to climate change can be evaluated through a single system, including the establishment of a greenhouse gas reducing, adaptation, technological support, and transparency system in 197 countries around the world. The establishment of a transparency system here means negotiations on establishing systematic procedures and guidelines to report and review matters concerning climate change response activities and support. In accordance with the Paris Agreement, all parties agreed to submit to the United Nations the 2050 Long-Term Low-Carbon Development Strategy and 2030 National Greenhouse Gas Reduction Target by 2020 to limit the increase in global average temperature to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Here, the 2050 Long-Term Low Greenhouse Gas Emission Development Strategies refers to the long-term vision and national strategy established by all countries to suppress the increase in global average temperature to 2 degrees Celsius or less by 2050 and further achieve carbon neutrality. In addition, the National Greenhouse Gas Reduction Target, i.e. NDC, is a plan that all parties are recommended to officially submit to the UN every 5 years from 2020 in accordance with the Paris Agreement. It contains targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adaptation to climate change and procedures and methods to achieve them. The National Greenhouse Gas Reduction Targets submitted for 2020 cover plans through 2030. As of April 2021, 137 countries around the world have expressed their will to be carbon neutral to overcome the climate crisis. In particular, the EU, a major country, declared carbon neutrality in December 2019, China in September 2020, and Korea and Japan in October 2020. The United States also returned to the Paris Agreement in January 2021 and set a target of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. The picture shown on the screen shows the global carbon neutrality trend as of April 2021. The outer semicircle figure shows the countries that have declared carbon neutrality and the carbon neutrality target time points for each country. As of April 2021, 137 countries have declared carbon neutrality, and among them, many countries have declared that they will achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 or sooner, with the exception of Australia, Singapore, China, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. In addition, the map shows how far each country has reached the stages in which efforts to achieve carbon neutrality are under discussion, legislative restrictions, implementation plans, and legalization. In countries such as the UK, Sweden, and New Zealand, legislation has been completed. It can be seen that many other countries are taking steps to establish a legal basis for promoting carbon neutrality. Most countries that declared carbon neutrality have pledged to reduce carbon emissions through renewable energy expansion, energy efficiency enhancement, green transportation, green agriculture, and ecosystem protection, and invest in innovative technologies and research, including CCUS, a storage technology for carbon dioxide capture. Then, let's take a closer look at the progress of carbon neutrality and implementation plan for each sector in major countries, including the European Union, the United States, China, and Japan, and Korea's. First, the European Union. The European Union declared a climate environmental emergency and adopted a resolution calling for EU members to be carbon neutral by 2050. The resolution announced a European Green Deal aimed at neutralizing 2050 carbon emissions and set it as an urgent issue to be selected as a first national agenda of the European Union. Through the enactment of the European Climate Act, the European Union members are legally institutionalized to aim for carbon neutrality by 2050. The European Union plans to significantly increase the proportion of renewable energy, including offshore wind power, to achieve carbon neutrality in the energy sector. It also plans to provide clean energy by actively connecting innovative technology infrastructure, such as smart grids, and improving energy infrastructure to meet carbon-neutral target. In addition, the Energy Act is expected to be amended, if necessary, to improve energy efficiency. In order to achieve green transformation in the industrial sector, it is proposed to develop circular economy products and markets, such as fostering eco-friendly low-carbon innovative technologies and encouraging green consumption by providing information on carbon emission to consumers by using digital technology. Energy efficiency improvement of buildings will be implemented in the building sector, and diversification of transportation will be implemented in the transportation sectors. Introducing regulations is also being considered to reduce carbon emissions. In 2023, a carbon border tax, one of the trade tariffs, will be implemented when exporting goods and services from countries with high greenhouse gas emissions to countries with low emissions. In addition, plastic taxes are imposed on plastic waste, and it strengthens the average emission standard of vehicles sold by pushing for regulations on automobile emissions that impose fines on manufacturers if the emission standard is exceeded. Next is the United States. After taking office, President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement, which former U.S. President Donald Trump withdrew from, and declared that the United States would strengthen diplomatic efforts to raise the reduction target by 2030, and introducing a carbon border tax in 2025 to link trade policy and climate policy. The United States rejoined the Paris Agreement in January 2021. President Biden emphasized that carbon-emitting power generation facilities will be stopped by 2035 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the power generation sector, and that eco-friendly renewable energy will be introduced and achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. As such, the United States expressed a strong will to recover its climate leadership and take active action in the international community by making up for the lukewarm attitude of the previous administration in response to climate change. In addition, the United States established ARPA-C, a general research project on climate change, in February 2021 to develop innovative and cost-effective technologies for carbon neutrality in 2050. Here, the project refers to a project equivalent to ARPA-E, which has been conducting research on the development of cutting-edge energy technology that is difficult for the private sector to invest in, as a general research project on climate change operated by the U.S. Department of Energy. Through this, United States is pursuing climate innovation by reinforcing technology development such as carbon-neutral building, low-cost carbon-free transportation, strengthening energy storage capacity, and developing CCUS technology. Next is China. President Xi declared in his 75th UN General Assembly address in September 2020 that China has declared that it will reduce carbon emissions with a peak in 2030 and strengthen its reduction targets to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Specifically, the goal is to increase the proportion of non-fossil fuel energy from 15% to 20% by 2025. And from February 2021, they will officially implement the nationwide carbon emission trading market. Next is Japan. In his address to the Parliament in October 2020, Prime Minister Suga declared the 2050 carbon neutral goal. Then, in December 2020, a green growth strategy is established to realize carbon neutrality in 2050, and it is selected as an industrial policy to promote a virtuous cycle of economy and environment. Specifically, the country plans to reduce costs by promoting decarbonization in the electric power sector and electrification in the industrial, transportation, and household sectors, and introducing and expanding energy storage technology. Then how about our country? As mentioned earlier, Korea also declared in October 2020 that it would achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And on December 30th, the 2050 Long-Term Low-Carbon Development Strategy and 2030 National Greenhouse Gas Reduction Target were submitted to the Secretariat of UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. In the 2030 NDC, Korea sets a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 24.4% compared to 2017 by 2030. The significance of the NDC submitted this time can be broadly explained in three ways. First, the amount of emission reduction targeted by 2030 has been changed to the absolute quantity method. Previously, Korea had proposed the 2030 BAU method, that is, a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a certain percentage based on Korea's 2030 greenhouse gas emissions expected when no artificial measures are taken to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. However, in the NDC submitted this time, the reduction target was set more clearly by specifically the reduction standard as the 2017 emission amount, which is an accurate value. Second, in this NDC, the proportion of domestic reduction among the total reduction targets was greatly increased. Previously, the proportion of overseas cuts through overseas afforestation projects was very large, so there have been issues such as whether the domestic reduction efforts have been neglected and whether the overseas reduction performance can be secured sufficiently. However, this NDC expressed its will to strengthen efforts to reduce greenhouse gases in Korea by minimizing foreign reduction. Finally, the NDC upgrade plan is specified. This clearly indicates that the 2030 reduction target will be raised before 2025. In addition, Korea is taking active steps to become a carbon neutral leader. Do you know about P4G? P4G is a global consultative body to respond to climate change and achieve sustainable development goals. It is a 21st century converged organization in which government agencies and companies, civil society, etc., which are in private sector, participate as partners. In May 2021, the second P4G summit was held in Seoul. It is very meaningful in that the first multilateral conference on the environment was held in Korea in the first year of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. At the P4G summit, Korea took the lead in discussing the Green Recovery Agenda by setting the role of the Green New Deal as a key agenda for achieving carbon neutrality. At the meeting, the Seoul Declaration containing matters related to Korea's forward-looking climate action, such as the importance of carbon-neutral vision and green transition, and the 2050 carbon-neutral strategic plan was adopted. 2. Paradigm shift in economy and industry. As more and more countries participate in actions to achieve carbon neutrality, the economic and industrial paradigm shifts centered on major countries such as the USA and EU. A new international order is being created to realize carbon neutrality. Then, how is the new international order different from the one before, and how will it affect Korea? Let's take a closer look at this. First, let's look at the shift in the economic paradigm. The first is the application of social costs to carbon emissions. Price is the most important word in the principle of market economy. Almost everything is determined by the price of how much a product will be produced, which raw materials will be used, and which technology will be used. However, in the pricing process of the traditional economic paradigm, the social cost of carbon, that is, greenhouse gas emissions, was excluded. Obviously, someone has benefited economically from emitting huge amounts of carbon, but no one is responsible for the climate change caused by the carbon emitted into the atmosphere. Therefore, attempts have been made to internalize the social costs of carbon emissions into the principles of the market economy by changing the existing economic paradigm. The carbon border tax is used as a representative means. Carbon border tax is a type of additional tariff imposed on products produced by countries or companies that emit a lot of carbon. If a carbon frontier tax is introduced, offshore companies will pay the equivalent of what the local industry has to pay for reducing carbon emissions. It gives a strong signal to countries and companies that are passive in reducing carbon emissions. In other words, it creates economic incentives for them to be more active in reducing carbon emissions. The European Union is leading the way in introducing a carbon border tax. As mentioned briefly earlier, the European Union has already announced the introduction of a carbon border tax in 2023 and is discussing detailed operational plans for this. And the Biden administration said it is considering introducing a carbon border tax. Therefore, Korea must prepare well for such a situation. This is because Korea's greenhouse gas emissions are huge enough to rank within the top 10 in the world, and it has an industrial structure centered on industries that emit greenhouse gases, such as steel, petrochemicals, etc., and is highly dependent on trade. If Korea does not prepare in advance for the new international order, export opportunities for carbon-intensive companies will decrease, especially in carbon-intensive industries. Second is the transformation of the global market structure. The global market structure is also being reorganized in the direction of inducing private companies to respond to climate change. The global market structure is changing to a disadvantage for environmentally unfriendly companies, with BlackRock, world's largest asset management company, requesting companies to submit greenhouse gas emissions and establish and disclose reduction plans for major companies. As a spread of environmental management, major companies in each country are participating in the RE100 campaign, expressing that they will procure 100% of the electricity needed for business activities from new energy generation power, or expanding the ESG business. In response, major Korean companies are also introducing management to cope with climate change. Every year, more and more companies are reporting the amount of carbon emission and reduction results generated during the business process, and by the end of 2020, 6 subsidiaries of the SK Group, which consume about 5% of Korea's annual electricity consumption, have declared that they will join the RE100 by 2050. Third is the growth of eco-friendly green markets and expansion of climate finance. The International Energy Agency predicts that the power generation capacity of renewable energy, such as solar power and wind power, will grow to about double the size of the second half of 2020 by 2025, and the lithium-ion second battery market is expected to grow about 17 times over the next decade due to increased demand for electric vehicles and energy storage. The eco-friendly green market is growing rapidly in the other side. In addition, as mentioned earlier, as major countries such as the EU and the US are foreshadowing large-scale green investments, such as the introduction of green renewable energy in Europe, the eco-friendly green market is expected to emerge as a new driving force in the international market going forward. On the other hand, Korea has excellent technology in this field. Korea's EV battery share was the world's #1 in 2020. In hydrogen vehicle sales, also ranked first in the world in 2019. In addition, in ESS market, an essential element in converting to a power generation system using renewable energy, Korea has the largest market share in the world. Furthermore, Korea's ESS safety test methods and procedures have been adopted as international standards. Therefore, if Korea actively supports these businesses through the Korean version of the New Deal, it will be able to achieve carbon neutrality and preoccupy the global market at the same time. This time, let's take a look at the shift of the industrial paradigm. The global industrial paradigm is already shifting from fossil fuels to a low-carbon base. It is fundamentally changing the industrial structure in preparation for a carbon-neutral era. As mentioned earlier, Korea is highly dependent on industries with high carbon emissions and has a very high proportion of coal-fired power generation known to generate relatively more carbon emissions. So, at first glance, you may feel that it is changing in an unfavorable direction for our country. But it is not negative only. This is because if we actively promote carbon neutrality, we have the technological conditions to lead the changing industrial paradigm. In other words, carbon neutrality is an inevitable choice to respond to the newly created international order and an opportunity to discover new industrial engines. Then, while looking at how the global industry is changing, let's think about how the industrial structure of Korea should also change. First, to summarize the direction of the industrial paradigm shift in one word would be decarbonization. The plan is to drastically reduce carbon emissions in sectors where fossil fuel use has traditionally been concentrated, such as power generation and manufacturing industries. To this end, a clear increase in the share of renewable energy generation is noticeable. Renewable energy's low-price competitiveness has been pointed out as a weakness because of its low power generation efficiency compared to fossil fuels. However, as an energy source that emits less carbon compared to fossil fuels, the supply of renewable energy increases every year thanks to the spread of technology improvement and the transition to eco-friendly energy. As of 2018, the share of renewable energy among global power generation facilities has increased to 33%. The transition to renewable energy is expected to continue at a rapid pace. The International Energy Agency predicted that oil demand will peak in 2030 through the World Energy Outlook 2020. Over the next 10 years, 80% of the global demand for electricity is expected to be met by renewable energy, led by solar, land, and offshore wind. Under these circumstances, the EU has chosen hydrogen as a renewable energy source to replace fossil fuels. It proposed the realization of hydrogen economy through development of clean hydrogen as a mid to long-term goal to achieve carbon neutrality. And by making large investments in clean hydrogen production technology using renewable energy, the proportion of hydrogen energy in all energy sources will be increased from 2% in 2020 to 23% by 2050. In addition, decarbonization is being promoted in various ways in the manufacturing sector. Support is provided to the steel industry, a representative energy-intensive industry, to help develop low-carbon process technology, and the petrochemical industry is responding to the transition to a low-carbon paradigm of new materials, such as bioplastics that can replace fossil fuels, such as cokes and naphtha. There are also attempts to converge digital and energy. Smart factories that incorporate ICT technology into the manufacturing process are being introduced in many countries. A smart factory equipped with IoT sensors and cameras collects big data necessary for factory operation and operates the factory energy efficiently based on it. In addition, elements of the circular economy are being introduced to increase the efficiency of resource and energy use. The circular economy is a system that maximizes the resource recovery rate by reusing products rather than discarding them after consumption is complete. Since carbon emission can be reduced by reducing resource and energy use, more and more countries are introducing elements of the circular economy throughout the industrial structure. Meanwhile, the scientific community has suggested the introduction of a system that can evaluate and verify carbon emission reduction in response to the international community's efforts to realize carbon neutrality. The Paris Agreement requires each party to voluntarily set national greenhouse gas reduction targets, but emphasizes procedural transparency in all processes. The most important aspect of procedural transparency is to accurately measure, submit, and verify carbon emissions and implementation performance. Carbon neutralization performance can be checked objectively and transparently if carbon circulation modeling is carried out using carbon emission inventory, carbon absorption selection, and carbon concentration observation suggested by the scientific community. Everyone, this time we looked at the current status of carbon neutrality promotion in the international community and Korea, and the paradigm shift in economy and industry. How was it? Korea declared 2050 carbon neutral in October 2020. Is it possible to become carbon neutral in 2050 based on the current carbon emissions of Korea? Here is a question. It is reported that Korea's greenhouse gas emissions reached a peak in 2018. On the other hand, considering the fact that greenhouse gas emissions have continued to decrease since the peak of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States in 2007, Japan in 2013, and Germany in 1990, it can be seen that the time remaining for Korea is much tighter. In other words, to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, much more effort is needed than other countries. It is in the same context that Korea further raises the 2030 national greenhouse gas reduction target and submits it to the UN in 2021. This time, we were able to look at the efforts of each country to achieve carbon neutrality. Looking forward to the paradigm of the economy and industry that will change in the future, we will meet next time. See you! Try to remember the important content again. 137 countries around the world declared 2050 carbon neutral. EU, a major country, declared carbon neutrality in December 2019. China in September 2020. And Korea and Japan in October 2020. And innovative plans are being established for energy efficiency improvement, decarbonization, expansion of low-carbon transportation and renewable energy, CCUS technology development, carbon border tax, etc. Through the European Climate Act of June 2011, the European Union reduced its net emissions by 55% in comparison with 1990 and legally binding on its carbon-neutral goals by 2050, and announced the European Green Deal, which aims to be carbon neutral by 2050. The United States declared that the United States would strengthen diplomatic efforts to raise the reduction target by 2030, and introducing a carbon border tax in 2025 to link trade policy and climate policy. China has declared that it will reduce carbon emissions with a peak in 2030 and strengthen its reduction targets to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. In Japan, a green growth strategy is established to realize carbon neutrality in 2050, and it is selected as an industrial policy to promote a virtuous cycle of economy and environment in December 2020. December 30th, the 2050 Long-Term Low-Carbon Development Strategy and 2030 National Greenhouse Gas Reduction Target were submitted to UNFCCC. In the NDC, Korea sets a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 24.4% compared to 2017 by 2030. In addition, Korea plans to announce the 2030 NDC Reinforcement Plan at the 26th United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in November 2021, and at the second P4G Summit held in Seoul in May 2021, Korea took the lead in discussing the Green Recovery Agenda by setting the role of the Green New Deal as a key agenda for achieving carbon neutrality. The eco-friendly green market and climate finance are rapidly expanding as unfavorable conditions are being created for countries and companies that emit high carbon emissions, such as the imposition of a carbon border tax and the transformation of the global market structure. In addition, as decarbonization progresses throughout overall industry and technologies that converge digital and energy are developed and introduced, circular economic factors that maximize energy and resource use efficiency are being incorporated. If Korea proactively responds to these changes in economic and industrial paradigms by actively promoting structural improvement for carbon neutrality, it will be possible to turn crisis into opportunity and lead a new economic and industrial paradigm.